March of the Lich King reveal season just keeps on rolling. We've now seen all of the cards for the Deathknight class, the Paladin class, as well as all the neutral cards. I'm Uncorrupt. Let's take a look and see what's going to be coming. Right off the bat, I want to take a look at the neutral cards. If you're familiar with me and the way I tend to look at things, neutral cards are almost always bad. There's going to be very few of these cards that are actually going to see play, but I do think there's some cards that are going to be worth talking about here, and some of them actually just happen to be right here on the top row. Bone Flinger just kind of gets like an honorable shout out. I feel like something like this could be used in a rogue deck, specifically with field contact. It's a Battlecry minion. It'll draw a card with the field contact, so a rogue could play this, Shadow Step, replay it. It's going to be damage from hand. It's going to draw cards. Could be a little bit of potential there. We won't really know until we get to see more of the rogue cards. Also of note here could be Plague Spreader. Again, this card is just going to work as some kind of disruption, being able to turn a minion in our opponent's hand into a Plague Spreader. Could potentially have some value if combo decks are a thing, or if the Nathrius tends to linger around in the meta. Certainly not great, but could be an option, although still not very good. Cruel Necrolite. This card is pretty interesting. It's not great as a neutral card. I feel like a lot of classes are going to have better options, but it's not bad if you can stick a 1-drop on the board, play this on turn 2. If you have to trade with your 1-drop and then still end up with a 2/2 zombie with Rush, might see some play. Again, not great, but does have possibly a little bit of potential. Nerubian Vizier is actually a really interesting card. 3 mana, 2/4. Discover a spell. If a friendly undead died after your last turn, it costs 2 less. Keeping in mind that after your last turn means that you could potentially trade an undead minion on this turn, play this, be able to discover a spell that costs 2 less. Mana Cheat is always really good in Hearthstone. If you're able to actually discount the card that you're discovering, you could almost think of this as like a 1 mana 2/4. Starts to sound a little bit better like that. I would expect this card to see some play. Discover, usually a pretty good mechanic. Lots of the other cards here really just not that good and really not worth talking about, at least in my opinion. Egg might be able to see some kind of play in an aggro deck, but unfortunately right now aggro is just kind of a dead archetype. And I think as long as Renathal is in the format, it's going to continue to be, unfortunately, a somewhat, if not totally dead archetype. Of note here is, though, Bone Lord Frost Whisper. This card could potentially enable some combo decks. I've done some theory crafting with it myself that I'll talk a little bit more about later on. But just being able to get your first card for free at the beginning of the turn is a really powerful mechanic. And then, of course, it puts a clock on the game. The game's not going to last any more than 3 turns. But being able to play a really expensive card for free to start your turn and then still have all your mana, I'm sure you can imagine, could lead to some very powerful combo decks. So far, I'm looking at things like Frost DK could potentially use something like this. It looks like there may be some type of Arcane Mage OTK deck. And really any class that's going to have a lot of direct damage that could go face. Shaman is another class that has a lot of potential, a lot of burn damage in that class. The only drawback here is that it's actually a death rattle. That means it's going to be vulnerable to silence. And it's also going to be vulnerable to something like a Sylvanas that would be able to pull it to our opponent's side of the board here. But if you're able to get the death rattle off, you should be in good shape for a combo deck. And potentially there may be some decks that can play this and kill it in their same turn to be able to set up the combo for the following turn. So definitely worth keeping an eye on this card. Another honorable mention here, Coroner. This is potentially just a 2 mana silence as we get up to turn 6 and on in a game. 2 mana silence could be something that's relevant. We won't really know until we see what the meta is going to shape up to be. Again, a lot of these cards just not good. We're going to scroll through a couple of more honorable mentions here. Silvermoon Arcanist, +2 spell damage with a battle cry. Your spells can't target heroes this turn. This card may not be great now, but if Blizzard ever prints a card that doesn't allow battle cries to go off this turn, your battle cry minions don't take effect this turn, or whatever that card would read, and it's just a straight +2 spell damage for 3 mana, this card could definitely see some play at some point in the future. I don't think now, but it's worth keeping in mind and worth keeping an eye on as times go by. Enchanter, again, an honorable mention. Enemy minions take double damage on your turn. It's just something to keep an eye on. There is going to be some lifesteal cards, certainly with Deathknight, possibly with other classes as well. And enemy minions taking double damage, this could potentially enable some other board clears. At 3 mana, it's not super powerful. We don't really care about the body. It's just the text on the card. And 3 mana could be just a little bit expensive. But again, something to keep in mind, something to keep an eye on. Astalor Bloodsworn, I think, is actually probably one of the better cards in the entire set. First of all, it's just value. You play this card, and you get an additional card in the 5 mana version, and then you get an additional card in the 8 mana version as well. The reason why I think it's so good is just because the text on the card on the 2 mana and 8 mana version is really good. You play the 2 mana version, deal 2 damage, so you're perfectly comfortable playing this on turn 2. 5 mana version is, just a little bit weaker in gaining 7 armor. This is all, of course, assuming that you're at the mana thirst crystals that you're going to need to activate these effects. But then also just the final version of this, 8 mana, 8/8, deal 8 damage, mana thirst 10, deal 8 more. There's going to be spots where this card is actually stronger than Denathrius as a source of damage to end the game. On turn 10, you can drop this for 8 mana, potentially deal 16 damage, and then also have 2 mana to still be able to do something else. In games where you would draw Denathrius and you draw the Denathrius late, you haven't really been able to infuse the Denathrius, this could be bigger or better game-ending damage at certain points of certain games, so it's definitely something worth keeping an eye on. And it feels like it's probably going to be a little bit more balanced. If Denathrius was capped, at the 15, 16 damage mark, then maybe, people may not complain about Denathrius so much, but I feel like this card is really strong, and I think it's going to see an absolute ton of play as we move on throughout the expansion. Probably a lot of classes are really going to be able to use that. Especially with it being a neutral, everybody has access to it. Invincible is maybe kind of an honorable mention. 8 mana is just really expensive, even though, the Battle Cry and the Death Rattle are pretty good with this card, just being able to give a friendly undead minion, +5/+5. But 8 mana just kind of makes me a little bit wary of the card. Typically, cards that are that expensive don't see play outside of Druid just because of Druid being able to ramp, and now, of course, being able to get up to 20 mana crystals when they play Guff. Lorthamar Theron, again, this is just another honorable mention here. Battlecry, double the stats of all minions in your deck. It's going to be really interesting. This is a card that if you draw it and play it early in the game, like turn 6 or turn 7, it's going to be really good because your minions are just twice as big. But it's a card also that's going to have a lot of feels bad games. If you draw it later in the game, it's going to be totally irrelevant because the game will already be over by the time you can play it. But there could be some interesting things that come out of this card as well. It's going to definitely be worth keeping an eye on. This could maybe enable, some kind of OTKs or certainly big damage burst combos if you're able to, who knows, maybe have a Mr. Smite in your deck and this doubles the stats. But again, could be unreliable based on when you're going to draw this card and be able to get it in play. And one final honorable mention for the neutral cards here, neutral healing coming back into the game. Sunfury Clergy, restore 3 health to all friendly characters. That's going to be your hero and your minions. Mana Thirst 6, restore 6 health instead. So at turn 6 and beyond, this card is going to be a 6 health heal for your board as well as your face. Has the potential there to be pretty strong, and maybe with a card like this kind of paves the way for Blizzard to be able to nerf or totally remove Renathal. With neutral healing in the game, every class would have access to some kind of healing. Maybe we don't need that 10 extra starting health. Moving on to the Paladin class specifically, Paladin was actually given 2 different packages. We have kind of the Dragon package, and then we also have a package of like self-harm where you get, buffs or, some extra things happen because you're actually able to spend some of your life to be able to make that happen, and a couple of standalone cards. So taking a closer look at these, we have the Dragon package here. The Dragon package is actually looking pretty good in Paladin. Some of these cards actually seemingly pretty strong here. We'll just go right down the line. Daring Drake, if you're holding a dragon, gain an additional 1/1, so this could be a 4 mana 5/5 with Rush. It's going to feel really powerful on turn 4 to be able to play this, remove minions on your opponent's side and be able to have a leftover minion, or even just, play it on an empty board and have a 5/5 minion going into the next turn. For only 4 mana, feels like that could be pretty good. Flight of the Bronze, discover a dragon, mana Thirst 7, summon a 5/5 Drake with Taunt. It's an interesting card. We're going to have to see how things play out. I feel like the mana thirst on this could have been 6, possibly even 5. Mana Thirst 7, it's going to be, well into the game before you can get the 5/5 Drake with Taunt. But again, Discover, typically just a pretty good mechanic because you can pick what you need. Time Warden, this is just another interesting card here. Battlecry, until the end of your next turn, dragons you summon gain Taunt and Divine Shield. Keywords here, until the end of your next turn. So we could potentially play this on turn 4, and then any dragon we would play on turn 5 would gain Taunt and Divine Shield. Could be some interesting things that are going to happen with this card as well. And then rounding out the dragon package, we have Anachronos, a text that we've never seen in Hearthstone before. Battlecry, send all other minions 2 turns into the future. The developers have explained that this is just going to remove the minions from the board. In 2 turns, those minions are going to come back on the board, and any minions that there are no room for are just going to be totally destroyed. I would assume that they're going to come back in the order they were played, similar to how when Scabs is played and those minions are put back into your hand, the most recent minions that you played, if you don't have room for them, get destroyed. I would expect that it's pretty reasonable to believe that that's how Anachronos is going to work as well. For the dragon package, I've kind of roughed out a shell of a deck here that would be like a dragon paladin shell, and I think this deck could have some legs. It could be pretty interesting here, but just kind of put in the key dragon cards. Flight of the Bronze, Amber Whelp. This is a neutral card. I didn't really give it an honorable mention just because it's going to be so niche, but if you're holding a dragon, deal 3 damage. I think it could fit in pretty well with this deck. Then, of course, we would be running like Bronze Explorers. I think Snapdragons would belong in a Dragon Paladin deck, just because all of these dragons are a battle cry. So if you play this, anything you draw after it's going to get an additional 1/1. Sounds pretty good to me. Time Wardens may not actually make the cut. I'm not sure how good this text box actually is. We don't necessarily care about the 3/5 body, but I kind of look at this as almost like a spell that has a 3/5 body. So could be some upside there. We're just going to have to see how things play out. Could be interesting. Could actually just be a cut from this deck. Amber Watchers, just because I feel like we may need some healing. After Kazakhstan comes down, we might have to actually spend 5 mana to be able to heal ourselves. Anachronos, certainly worth a play. It's going to be good at buying ourselves time. And Kazakhstan is just going to be our win condition in this deck. And some cards that I actually left out here that was really silly of me to do is, with this deck, we would want to make sure that we would be running Order in the Court, which is going to be a Paladin-specific card here. We would want to run 2 copies of Order in the Court, and then we would also want to be running 2 copies of the Stonehearth Vindicator here. So being able to play Order in the Court early in the game would guarantee that we draw Kazakhstan, and as long as we're able to play 4 dragons sometime before turn 8, basically every game we should be able to play Kazakhstan on turn 8, have our win condition in play, and then start drawing those powerful Kazakhstan cards. The only danger with a deck like this would be if our opponent was able to snowball the board early and we just take too much damage so that Kazakhstan ends up being too slow. That's where I think things like the Amber Whelp could be good. It's going to be good tempo for us. We can deal 3 damage, remove a minion from our opponent's side of the board here. Also of note, I suppose, would be that this 3 damage could go face. You know, potentially might be some lethal situations there. But just being able to guarantee draw a win condition and potentially being able to play Kazakhstan on turn 8 or turn 9 active every single game feels like this deck could actually be pretty strong. Going back to take a look at what I'm calling the self-harm package for Paladin, we have Seal of Blood. Give a minion 3/3 Divine Shield, deal 3 damage to your hero. We have the 1 mana Sanguine Soldier. Battle Cry, deal 2 damage to your hero for a 1 mana 2/1 with Divine Shield. And then, of course, we have the Blood Crusader. Next Paladin minion this turn costs health instead of mana. These cards are really going to be interesting. I'm not sure how good they're going to be, but I definitely think they're going to deserve some experimentation. Certainly, with Blood Crusader, playing a card like this opens up for some of the more expensive Paladin minions, maybe like Brass Wings. Being able to play a 9/7 that has a Consecration-like effect could be pretty good if you can get it down on turn 6 rather than, you know, turn 8 as the card itself costs. Also, there's just some other buff cards here. You know, we have the Feast and Famine. Give our hero attack, Mana Thirst. We can get some lifesteal at turn 4 and above. And then just another Holy buff card here. Give a friendly minion 3 attack and your hero 2 attack this turn. Again, could be a little bit interesting. Of note with these cards, they're both Holy spells. And then we have the legendary Blood Matriarch Liadrin. After you summon a minion with less attack than this, give it Divine Shield and Rush. So it only starts with 3 attack, but if we can land one of these buffs on it to get that attack number higher, we can potentially give some, you know, relevant minions Divine Shield and Rush. Could be good. Kind of a shell that I roughed out for Paladin here, utilizing some of these new cards, is I was theorizing an aggro deck. And again, aggro is kind of a dead archetype here in the Renathal metas that we've been having, or that we, you know, will be continuing to have as March of the Lich King launches. But the idea for this deck is just to develop a board to be able to buff it with cards like Forequell Thalas, Hold the Bridge, Seal of Blood. We're playing Stonehearth Vindicators to be able to draw those 3 or less cost holy cards so that we can cast them for free. And then also Katori Lightblade. This might actually be this card's time to shine. After you cast a holy spell on this, cast it again on another friendly minion. This is not a March of the Lich King minion, but it could be a minion that could see some use with additional holy spells coming into the game from this new expansion. Also, I think Sunwing Squawker, there's going to be enough buffs in the game that Sunwing Squawker may actually be able to come back and see some play. Again, I don't have a high level of confidence in this deck, but this is kind of the shell, and then we would just need to figure out the other cards that we would need to really be able to make this deck go. Taking a look at the Deathknight cards here, these are the 10 cards for the Deathknight. They're going to be part of the March of the Lich King set. I'm not going to be covering the Path of Arthas cards here. I'm also not going to be covering the Deathknight core set. We're just going to take a look specifically at these 10 cards that are going to be part of the March of the Lich King set. When you look at these cards, Deathknight I'm sure has been covered ad nauseum. You've probably heard tons and tons of opinions about it. I've tried to avoid a lot of that stuff. I try not to taint my own opinions with the opinions of other people just so that I have potentially maybe something original to be able to say. But looking at these cards, specifically, very interestingly, first of all, I would say that with Deathknight, Blizzard has advertised this as a class that is going to be able to have like a serious deck building component to it because of the different runes and the rune cost of the cards. I would say here right off the bat, I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to be the case. I don't know, and I'm sure Blizzard doesn't either. We're going to have to see how the players react to this and what people are using to build their decks. But to me, there's a fundamental issue with the way that this works. These 3 rune cost cards, for example, this 3 blood rune card, these cards have to be really strong, otherwise you would just never play them. They have to be strong enough that you would exclude all cards from the other 2 runes. So they're going to have to be really strong, otherwise why even print them? They're just never ever going to be able to see play. The problem is, if they're that strong, how can you justify not putting it in your deck? If they're that strong, you have to play it. And so what I'm afraid we're going to end up with is decks that are 3 unholy, decks that are 3 frost, decks that are 3 blood, and then we're not going to see these hybrid decks that are utilizing cards from the different runes. We'll see as things get going, but that's one concern that I have about the rune system. It may actually come to be pretty limiting more so than freeing and a deck building component. Getting into the specific cards though, we have these 3 blood rune cards that are going to be part of the March of the Lich King set for Deathknight. Alexandros Mograine, looking like a pretty solid card. This really just puts your opponent on a timer and forces them to end the game within a certain number of turns before they die themselves, regardless of whether or not we're able to generate additional threats from our side or whatever else may be going on in the game. Soul Stealer clears the board, generates corpses, and puts a 5/5 in play. Again, just insanely strong card. 8 mana is expensive, but I feel like it's worth it just because it clears the board and it generates the new DK resource corpses. And we see the Vampiric Blood, give your hero 5 health, spend 3 corpses, gain 5 more, and draw a card. So these 3 cards, triple blood rune cards, and they are just perfect for a control Deathknight deck. I feel like the Blood Deathknight is going to be significantly better than what we saw in the Deathknight show match, if you were able to keep up with that. That happened recently. Not throwing any shade on any of the competitors. I know it's hard in short notice to be able to come up with decks, and there's no meta, and you have no idea what other people are going to play, but I feel like the Blood Deathknight decks can be built a little bit better maybe than what we saw in the Deathknight show match. So even though the Blood decks performed poorly, I think there's still some hope for Blood Deathknight, and I'm actually expecting Blood to be the strongest of the runes. A triple Blood Rune Deathknight I think is going to be a really good control deck, and I think it has potential to be maybe one of the better decks in the meta. We'll talk about that just a little bit more later. Moving on in the cards, we have the Bone Guard Commander. Basically just a board in the box, an 8/8. It's going to summon a small board of 1/2s with Taunt, as long as we have the corpses to be able to spend. Nothing spectacular about this card. It is a little bit expensive, but it does generate Taunts, so we can maybe justify spending the 8 mana on it. And when I see a card like this that summons a wide board, it just makes me think that this is a Denathrius Infuser. Denathrius is still around if it doesn't get nerfed, doesn't get changed. A card like this could go a long way, especially in a blood deck. In my opinion, you're probably going to be playing Denathrius anyway as a win condition. This is a way to be able to beef up that Denathrius number. Soulbreaker, 3 mana, 3/2 weapon. After your hero attacks and kills a minion, gain 2 corpses. So potentially corpse generation for blood. I think in every Deathknight deck, you're going to want to make sure that you're able to generate corpses as well as be able to spend those corpses. So could be good. Blood doesn't generate as many corpses as, say, like the Unholy card, so it could be good. 3 mana is expensive for a 3/2 weapon, but keep in mind, one of the other Deathknight cards that's not part of these 10 cards that are in the set is a 1 mana, draw a weapon, spend 1 corpse to be able to reduce the cost of that weapon by 1. So potentially, you're looking at a 2 mana, 3/2 weapon here, which might actually just be broken. We've seen 2 mana, 3/2 weapons be nerfed in the past. Although unlikely that you would be able to play it on turn 2 unless you had the coin, just based on the way the corpse mechanic is going to work, so on and so forth. Necrotic Mortician, a 2 unholy rune card. If a friendly undead died after your last turn, again, if your opponent kills it, or if you're able to make a trade on your current turn, discover an unholy rune card. think the card's going to be really solid. You know, it's the standard 2/3 body for a 2-drop. Discover is typically pretty good, and we've seen some pretty interesting and pretty strong Unholy Deathknight cards, so I think it's going to be good. Should see a lot of play in Deathknight decks here. Blight Fang, again, I feel like if you're playing a deck that's going to run at least one Unholy Rune, I feel like Blight Fang is actually just an auto-include. It feels really strong. It's going to act like a comeback mechanic, possibly even for aggro decks. If you get behind on board and you play this, then as you're able to remove minions on your opponent's side of the board, you're going to be generating 2/2 zombies with Taunt. I really like the card. It's a standard 3/3 body for a 3-mana card. It's just the effect that's really, really good on it. I expect that card is really going to see a lot of play. Meat Grinder, 3/4. Shred a random minion in your deck, gain 3 corpses. I don't like the card. You know, again, it's kind of a standard stat line at a 3-mana 3/4. Unholy has better ways of being able to generate corpses. Maybe you play this if you're playing a hybrid deck like a 2 Frost 1 Unholy or a 2 Blood 1 Unholy. Maybe if you just really need the corpses. I feel like there's better ways to get corpses really for any kind of DK deck that you could imagine. There could be some upside to shredding a minion in your deck. It's going to thin the deck just a little bit, but the downside is, again, we keep going back to Denathrius just because that's where the game is at, but imagine you play this on turn 3 and you shred your Denathrius. Is that an instant concede? Probably. So I just don't think it's necessarily worth the downside of what that card might bring, and I just think there's better options. Acolyte of Death, 3-mana 3/4, again, pretty standard stat line for what it is. So we looked at the text box. After a friendly undead dies, draw a card. This is conditional card draw. A lot of times conditional card draw just isn't all that good, and I feel like this falls in that category. There's just going to be better ways to be able to draw cards, really for any and every deck. I don't really expect the card to see play, just because the condition is so hard to meet. You have to have undead minions to be able to kill, and if your plan is to, on turn 5, play this and hero power and trade your, 1-mana 1/1 with Rush, 5 mana, get a 3/4 and draw a card is just really, really weak. So don't expect that card to see play, really not that good. And the final card to talk about here with the Deathknight set, Corpse Explosion. Detonate a corpse, deal 1 damage to all minions. If any are still alive, repeat this. Again, just an insanely strong control card. It's only 2 blood runes, so it does have the potential to go into a hybrid deck if necessary. But just being able to remove any board as long as you have enough corpses is really, really strong. Again, I think it fits great into a control deck, and I would expect that this card is going to see a lot of play in a control Deathknight deck. That's going to do it for this look at the Deathknight Paladin and neutral cards. If you're anything like me, you're starting to get really excited about getting your hands on a new class and being able to get your hands on new cards. Later on, I'm going to be covering additional classes as their cards have been fully revealed. I'm going to be doing these shells that you saw me do earlier. And as we get closer to expansion launch, I'm actually going to have fully theory-crafted decks that are going to be ready to go. So you can keep an eye on my channel for that. Specifically for Deathknight, one of my more recent videos, I actually did a theory-crafted deck for a triple blood, a triple frost, and a triple unholy rune deck. So if you're interested in those Deathknight decks, as well as additional thoughts on the Deathknight class, the Path of Arthas set, as well as the Deathknight core set, be sure and check that out. I'm Uncorrupt. Thank you for watching.